"You left me for 15 days and didn't think I'd notice?" I asked, standing in the kitchen with his unopened suitcase by my feet, the wheels still carrying sand from somewhere that definitely wasn't Chicago, and Ethan didn't answer right away, just smiled that same easy smile like I was overreacting, like I always did. "Val, it was work, I told you. Meetings ran long," he said, loosening his tie like he'd just walked out of a boardroom instead of a beach, and I remember staring at the faint line of sunburn along his neck, uneven, like he'd been wearing something open, something casual, something that didn't belong in any office I knew. "Meetings don't usually come with tan lines like that," I said quietly, and he laughed. Actually laughed, like I'd just made a cute little joke. "You're overthinking again," he replied, reaching past me for a glass of water, not even looking at me anymore, like the conversation was already over, like I was already dismissed. And that was the moment something in me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a precise click inside my chest where something finally stopped trying to hold this marriage together on my own. Before I go any further, if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, consider liking and subscribing, and maybe leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always wonder how far these stories travel and who they reach when it's quiet like this. My name is Valerie Cruz. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night I realized my husband had been living a life I was never meant to see. The night everything in my family quietly started to fall apart. But to understand how I got to that kitchen, standing barefoot on cold tile with a suitcase I didn't recognize, and a man I suddenly didn't either, you have to go back to where the cracks first started, because they didn't begin with that trip, not really. Ethan and I had been married for 7 years, together for 10, and for most of that time, I was the one who made things work, the one who adjusted, who listened, who stayed calm when he pulled away, who told myself that distance was normal, that stress changed people, that love meant giving someone space even when that space started to feel like an entirely separate life. And I believed that. I really did. Because it was easier than asking questions I wasn't ready to hear answers to. "You're lucky I put up with how much you work," he said once, standing in our living room while I was still on a call, my laptop open, spreadsheets filling the screen. Most guys wouldn't. And I muted myself just long enough to say, "I thought you liked that I'm independent." And he shrugged, already half turned away. "Independent is fine, Val, just don't forget your priorities." And I remember sitting there after the call ended, staring at my reflection in the black screen, trying to figure out when my priorities stopped, including myself. It wasn't always like that. At least I don't think it was. But somewhere along the way, I became the steady one, the quiet one, the one who didn't make scenes, who didn't question too much, who smiled at dinners when his coworkers joked about his work wife, Claire, like it was harmless, like it was funny. "She just gets my schedule better than anyone," he said one night, cutting into his steak while his brother laughed. "Honestly, sometimes I think she knows me better than Val does." And everyone chuckled like that was normal. Like that was something a husband could say without it landing somewhere deep and uncomfortable. And I smiled too, because that's what I did. I smiled and took a sip of water and told myself I was being sensitive again, that I was reading too much into things that didn't matter. But things started to matter when the patterns didn't line up anymore, when the late nights became entire weekends, when the explanations got shorter but the absences got longer, when his phone started turning face down on every surface. And still, I didn't go through it. I didn't check, because part of me didn't want to find anything that would force me to stop pretending everything was fine. And then came the trip, the one he mentioned casually over coffee, like it had just come up. "I might be gone for a bit, big client opportunity," he said, scrolling through his phone, not even looking at me. "How long is a bit?" I asked, stirring my coffee slowly, watching the way he hesitated just a fraction too long. "Couple days, maybe a week," he said, and that was the first lie. I know that now, because it turned into 15 days. 15 days of short texts, delayed responses, and one photo he sent of a conference room that had glass walls reflecting palm trees. And when I asked about it, he just said, "Hotel venue, nothing special," like I wouldn't notice the details. Like I didn't spend my entire career noticing the details people try to hide. The day he came back, I heard his car pull into the driveway before I saw him, and I stood there in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, heart steady in a way that surprised me, because I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even angry yet. I was just Done guessing, done filling in gaps with excuses, done being the only one protecting something that clearly didn't exist the way I thought it did. And when he walked in, smiling, relaxed, carrying that unfamiliar suitcase, I realized something else too, something he didn't know, something none of them knew, because while Ethan had been gone, I had finally stopped looking at him for answers and started looking somewhere else, somewhere much harder to lie to. And what I found there didn't just explain the trip, it changed everything I thought I knew about him, about her, about all of it, and standing there watching him pour himself a glass of water like nothing had happened, I understood one simple truth. He thought he came home to the same wife he left behind, but he had no idea who I had become while he was gone. And more importantly, he had no idea what I already knew. I did not always question him. Not like that. Not with that quiet certainty I felt in the kitchen that night. Because for most of my life, I had been trained to doubt myself first, to assume I was the one misunderstanding things, and that did not start with Ethan. It started long before him, back in a small 2-bedroom house in San Antonio, where everything was measured and compared, and somehow I was always the one coming up short. "Why can you not be more like your cousin Elena?" my mother would say, standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, not even looking at me as I stood there holding my report card. She helps her mother without being asked, and I remember tightening my grip on the paper, the corners bending slightly. "I got straight A's," I said quietly, and she nodded once, like that was expected, like it did not count as anything extra. "That is what you are supposed to do," she replied, turning back to the pot, conversation over. My father was quieter, but somehow that made it worse, because his silence felt like agreement, like confirmation that I was always just acceptable, never impressive, never enough to be noticed unless something went wrong. And when something did go wrong, even something small, it was never small in our house. "You forgot to take out the trash again?" he would say, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, and I would shake my head quickly. "I will do it now." Already moving, already fixing it, already trying to stay ahead of the disappointment, and he would sigh, that long, slow sigh that carried more weight than yelling ever could. "You need to be more responsible, Valerie," and I would nod, even if I had already done 10 other things that day that no one had noticed. It became a pattern, one I did not recognize at the time, but one that shaped everything that came after, the way I learned to anticipate needs, to smooth over tension, to stay quiet when something felt off, because speaking up never seemed to make things better. It only made me seem difficult, dramatic, ungrateful, words I heard often enough that they settled somewhere deep and stayed there. "Do not start," my mother would say, whenever I tried to explain how something felt unfair, her voice sharp enough to cut the air between us. "Other people have it worse," and that was the end of it every time, my feelings reduced to something unnecessary, something indulgent, something I should have known better than to bring up. I remember one Christmas, I was maybe 12, standing in the living room watching my younger brother open a brand new gaming console, the kind we had talked about for months, the one I thought we were both hoping for. And when it was my turn, I unwrapped a sweater. Soft, practical, something my mother said I needed for school. "You like it?" she asked, finally looking at me, and I smiled because that was what I did. "Yes, it is nice," I said, folding it carefully in my lap, and my brother laughed as his game loaded on the screen, bright colors filling the room, and I told myself it did not matter, that I should be grateful, that wanting more made me selfish, and that lesson stayed with me longer than any gift ever could. So when Ethan came into my life years later, confident, charming, sure of himself in a way I had never been, it felt like something steady, something certain, someone who knew what he wanted and chose me anyway. And for a while, that felt like enough, more than enough. But slowly, almost invisibly, the same pattern started to repeat, just in a different voice, a different setting, a different version of the same quiet imbalance. "You worry too much," he would say, brushing off my questions with a smile that made it sound like a compliment, like my concern was just part of who I was, something harmless, something to be managed rather than taken seriously. And I believed him, because I had spent my whole life being told that my instincts were too much, that my reactions were exaggerated, that my perspective needed adjusting. And it was easier to accept that than to consider that maybe I was seeing things exactly as they were. Even his family fit into that pattern so easily it almost felt familiar, like stepping into a role I already knew by heart. Ethan works so hard, you have to be patient with him," his mother told me once during dinner, placing her napkin neatly beside her plate, her tone polite but firm, like she was offering advice I should already understand. And I nodded. Because of course I did. Because being patient was something I had been practicing my entire life. "I am patient," I said softly, and she smiled, satisfied. Conversation closed, just like that. It was never one big moment. Never one obvious betrayal at the beginning. Just a series of small dismissals, quiet corrections, subtle reminders that my role was to support, to understand, to adapt, and over time, that becomes a kind of silence that feels normal, a kind of imbalance that feels expected. Until one day something shifts, something small but undeniable, and you realize that what you have been calling patience might actually be something else entirely. Standing in that kitchen, watching Ethan move around like nothing had changed, I felt that shift clearly for the first time. Not as confusion, not as doubt, but as clarity. And it was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, almost unsettling in its certainty, because it meant I could no longer pretend I did not see what was right in front of me, and more importantly, it meant I had to decide what to do with what I had already discovered. Because the truth I found while he was gone was not just about where he had been or who he had been with, it was about something much deeper, something that connected back further than I expected. Something that made all those small moments from my past line up in a way that felt impossible to ignore. And as I stood there listening to the sound of water filling his glass, I realized that this was not just about a trip or a lie. It was about a pattern that had followed me my entire life. And for the first time, I was not sure I was willing to stay quiet about it anymore. The first time something truly shifted in my life was not loud or dramatic. It did not come with applause or recognition. It came quietly on a Tuesday afternoon in a small office, with fluorescent lights that hummed just enough to make everything feel slightly unreal. When my supervisor called me in and closed the door behind me, "Valerie, have a seat," she said, her tone careful in a way that made my chest tighten, and I remember thinking I had done something wrong, that I had missed something, overlooked something, that I was about to be corrected again the way I always had been, but instead she slid a folder across the desk toward me. "We are expanding the compliance division, and I recommended you to lead the new audit team," she said, and I just stared at her for a second, not fully understanding what she meant. "Lead?" I repeated, my voice quieter than I intended, and she nodded. "You are the most detail-oriented person we have, Valerie. You see things other people miss." And for a moment I did not know how to respond, because no one had ever said something like that to me before. Not like that, not without a correction attached, not without a reminder of what I still needed to fix. And I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest, something steady, something that did not immediately shrink under doubt. When I told Ethan that night, standing in the same kitchen that would later feel so different, he looked up from his phone, gave a small nod, and said, "That is good, babe. Just do not let it take over everything." And I waited for something more, some sign that he understood what this meant to me, but it never came. So I smiled and said, "I will manage it," because that was what I always did. I managed things. I kept them balanced, even when they were not. His family reacted the same way, polite but distant, like my success was something abstract, something that did not quite register as important in their world. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility," his mother said over dinner, cutting her chicken carefully. "Ethan already works so much. You will need to make sure the house does not fall behind." And I nodded, even though the promotion meant more hours, more pressure, more visibility, because part of me still believed that if I handled everything well enough, if I stayed calm and capable and undemanding, eventually it would be enough, eventually someone would see me clearly. But something else started happening too. Something quieter but more significant. People at work began to rely on me, not just for tasks, but for judgment, for decisions, for insight. And with that came access, systems, information, patterns that most people never looked closely enough to notice. And I found that I was good at it, not just competent, but precise, intuitive in a way that surprised even me. And for the first time, I stopped second-guessing every instinct. I started trusting what I saw. "You caught that discrepancy before anyone else," one of the senior auditors told me, leaning against my desk. "Most people would have missed it." And I shrugged, trying to downplay it, But inside, something shifted again, a little stronger this time, a little harder to ignore. At home, though, that confidence did not translate the same way. If anything, it created more tension, subtle at first, then harder to ignore. "You have been on your laptop every night this week," Ethan said one evening, standing in the doorway of our bedroom, his arms crossed in that familiar way that made the room feel smaller. "I am working," I replied, not looking up, because I knew that tone. I knew where it led. "You are always working now," he said, and there was something underneath his words. Not concern, not exactly. Something closer to irritation, like my focus was inconvenient, like it disrupted something he expected to stay the same. And I closed my laptop slowly, meeting his eyes. "This is important," I said, and he held my gaze for a second before looking away. "Everything is important to you lately," he muttered, and walked out, leaving the door half open behind him. The tension grew in small ways after that. Comments that seemed casual but carried weight, jokes that were not really jokes, the kind that land differently when you start to notice patterns. "Valerie has become very serious these days," his brother said at a family barbecue, laughing as he handed Ethan a drink. "Careful, she might audit us next." And everyone chuckled, and I smiled, but Ethan added, "Yeah, she thinks she is running things now." And something in his tone made the laughter linger a little longer than it should have, made it feel like I was suddenly outside of the joke instead of part of it. It was around that time that Claire's name started coming up more often, not in any obvious way, just small mentions, casual references, like she was part of his routine. "Claire handled the client presentation today. She is good under pressure," he said one night, scrolling through his phone while I cleared the table, and I paused for just a second, then kept moving. "That is great," I replied, my voice even, and he nodded, not noticing anything at all, or pretending not to. At work, my responsibilities expanded quickly, audits that required deeper investigation, cases that involved inconsistencies that did not have simple explanations, and I found myself digging further, following trails that others would have stopped at, because I had learned that the real answers were never in the obvious places. They were hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to keep looking. One afternoon, reviewing a set of files that had been flagged for irregularities, I came across a name that made my hand pause over the keyboard, not because it was unusual, but because it felt familiar in a way I could not immediately place, and I sat there for a moment, staring at it, feeling that same quiet instinct I had started to trust, the one that told me when something did not fit, when something needed a closer look, and I told myself it was probably nothing, just a coincidence, just a common name, but something about it stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind long after I closed the file and moved on to the next task. And that night, as I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the house unusually quiet, I found myself typing that name again, not because I had to, but because I could not ignore the feeling that this was not random, that this was connected to something I had not yet fully seen. And as the results loaded slowly on the screen, I had no idea that this small decision, this simple act of looking just a little deeper, it was about to pull me into something far more complicated than I had ever expected. Something that would change the way I saw not only my husband, but everything I thought I understood about the life we were living. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, the glow from my laptop casting a pale light across the kitchen while everything else in the house stayed still and quiet. And for a moment, I almost closed it, almost convinced myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just a name that happened to match. But then the file loaded fully, and I felt it, that same small, precise shift inside my chest, only this time it was heavier, sharper, harder to ignore, because the name was not just similar, it was exact, Claire Matthews, and the details attached to it did not belong in my world, not in the life I thought I was living, not connected to my husband in any way that made sense, and yet there it was, clear, documented, real. I leaned back slowly in my chair, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, and I read everything again, line by line, not rushing, not reacting, just observing, the way I had trained myself to do. Because panic does not reveal truth. Attention does. And the more I read, the clearer it became that this was not a simple connection, not a random overlap. This was something ongoing, something recent, something that aligned too perfectly with the timeline Ethan had just given me for his so-called business trip. I closed the laptop halfway, just enough to dim the light, and sat there in the silence, letting it settle, because the shock did not come all at once. It came in layers, each realization building on the last, each detail removing another piece of the version of him I had been holding on to, and I realized something else too, something even more unsettling than the information itself. He had not just lied, he had built something around that lie, something structured, consistent, something that extended beyond a single trip or a single explanation. The next morning, I watched him move through his routine like nothing had changed, like everything was exactly the same, coffee poured at the same time, keys placed in the same spot, a quick glance at his phone before heading out the door, and I stood there by the counter, watching, listening, noticing the small things I had ignored before, the way he hesitated when I asked simple questions, the way his answers came just a second too late, just polished enough to feel rehearsed. "Do you want dinner tonight, or are you working late again?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, almost casual, and he shrugged, grabbing in his jacket. "I have a late meeting, probably grab something with the team," he said, and I nodded, like I always did, like I believed him, like I did not already know that the meeting he was referring to did not exist, at least not in the way he was describing it. "Okay," I said, turning back to the sink, and he paused for a second, watching me, like he was waiting for something, maybe a question, maybe resistance, but when it did not come, he relaxed. Just slightly. And that told me everything I needed to know about how deeply this pattern had settled into both of us. He expected silence, and I had always given it to him. That day at work, I moved through everything as usual, meetings, reports, conversations, but there was a difference now, a clarity that sharpened everything I looked at, because once you see a pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it, and every interaction started to feel like part of a larger structure, one that extended beyond my office, beyond my role, into my personal life in ways I had not fully understood until now. "You look tired," one of my colleagues said as she passed my desk, and I gave a small smile. "Just a long week," I replied, because explaining the truth would have required more than I was ready to give. And besides, the truth was still forming, still unfolding, still revealing itself piece by piece. That evening, Ethan texted me around 7. Dinner with the team ran late. "Do not wait up," and I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I was measuring it, comparing it, aligning it with everything else I had already seen. And then I set my phone down without responding, not out of anger, not out of frustration, but because I was done participating in something that was no longer real. I waited until later that night, until the house was quiet again, until I could open my laptop without interruption, and I went back to the file, this time not just reading, but tracing, following connections, timelines, cross-references, the same way I would in any audit, because that is what this had become, not a confrontation, not an argument, but an investigation, and the deeper I went, the more the structure revealed itself, the appointments, the dates, the overlap with his travel schedule, the consistency of it, the way everything aligned so precisely it could not be dismissed as coincidence. And then there was the detail that made everything else fall into place, the one piece that shifted this from suspicion to certainty, from confusion to understanding, and I sat there staring at it, my breath steady, my hands still, because this was the moment everything changed, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, completely. Because I understood now not just that he had lied, but how he had lied, how long he had been lying, and how easily everyone around us had accepted it as truth. The next day, his mother called, her voice warm, familiar. "Ethan told me about the big client trip. That is wonderful for him," she said, and I leaned against the counter listening carefully. "Yes, he mentioned it," I replied, my tone even, and she continued, "He works so hard. You should be proud." And I closed my eyes for just a second, because there it was again, the reinforcement, the validation of a story that was not real, the way a lie becomes truth simply because it is repeated enough, because it fits the narrative people expect, because no one looks closely enough to question it. "I am," I said finally, and the words felt strange as they left my mouth, not because they were entirely false, but because they were no longer complete, no longer aligned with what I knew. When Ethan came home later that night, everything looked the same on the surface. Same routine, same movements, same casual conversation. But something had shifted underneath, something he could not see yet. And as he walked past me, setting his phone down on the counter, I caught a glimpse of a message before the screen dimmed. Just a single line, a name I already knew, and a word that confirmed everything I had just uncovered. And in that moment, standing there in the quiet kitchen, I realized that whatever version of our life I had been holding on to was no longer intact because the truth was no longer hidden. It was right there, visible, undeniable, and there was no way to put it back the way it had been before. The first thing I noticed was not what he said. It was how quickly he started trying to fix something I had not even broken out loud yet, because the morning after that message, the one I only half saw but fully understood, he was suddenly attentive in a way that felt unfamiliar, like he was performing a version of himself he thought I needed to see. "I was thinking we could go out this weekend," he said, standing behind me while I made coffee, his voice softer than usual, almost careful, and I did not turn around right away. Just kept my hands steady on the counter, measuring out the grounds, listening to the shift in his tone. "We have not had time together in a while," he added, and I nodded slightly. "You have been busy," I replied, keeping it simple, because I wanted to hear what he would say next, without giving him anything to work with, and he hesitated, just for a second. "Yeah, work has been a lot," he said, and there it was again, the same structure, the same explanation, reinforced and repeated until it sounded almost believable even to him. Later that day, my phone rang while I was at my desk, his name lighting up the screen in the middle of a meeting I had not stepped out of once in months, and I stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hey," I said quietly, stepping into the hallway, and he spoke quickly, like he had been waiting for me to pick up. "I just wanted to check in, see how you were doing," and I leaned against the wall, watching people pass by without really seeing them. "I am fine," I said, and there was a pause on the other end, longer than necessary, like he was trying to read something in my voice that I was not giving him. "You seem distant," he said finally, and I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because of how familiar that word felt. How many times I had heard it when I started to pull back even slightly. When I stopped filling the space he left empty. "I am just working," I replied, and he exhaled slowly. "Okay, just let me know if something is wrong," he said, and I closed my eyes for a second, because something was wrong, but not in the way he meant, not in a way he was ready to hear. That afternoon, an email came through from him, subject line simple, "Dinner?" And I opened it out of habit more than interest, reading the short message he had written, like it was something formal, something deliberate. "Thought we could try that place you like on Clark Street, Friday at 7. And I sat there staring at the screen, noticing the effort, the structure, the way he was trying to reestablish something without addressing what had actually changed, and I typed a response slowly. "I will check my schedule," before closing the tab, because I did not want to give him certainty, not yet. That evening, he came home earlier than usual, carrying takeout bags from a place we had not ordered from in months. "Figured we could have a quiet night," he said, setting everything on the table, and I watched him move around the kitchen, placing containers, grabbing plates, creating something that looked normal, that felt almost familiar. But underneath it all, there was something else, something strained, something calculated. "You did not have a meeting?" I asked, sitting down slowly, and he shook his head. "It got canceled," he said too quickly, too smoothly. And I nodded, opening the container in front of me, the smell rising up in a way that should have been comforting but was not. "Val, is everything okay?" he asked after a few minutes, his voice quieter now, more direct, and I looked at him then, really looked at him, the man I had spent years understanding, supporting, adjusting to, and I realized how little he was actually seeing in return. "Everything is exactly as it has been," I said, and he frowned slightly, like he did not understand the weight of that sentence, like he thought it was reassurance instead of something else entirely. The messages started after that, small at first, then more frequent, texts during the day, "Thinking about you, hope your meeting went well, miss you," and I read every one of them, not responding right away, letting the silence stretch, because I wanted to see how far he would go, how much he would try to rebuild without ever acknowledging what had actually been broken. One night, close to midnight, My phone buzzed again, and I picked it up without thinking. His name on the screen. Another message, "We should talk," and I stared at it for a long moment before typing back. "About what?" And the typing bubble appeared almost instantly, then disappeared, then appeared again, like he was searching for the right words, the right version of the truth, before finally sending, "Just us. I feel like we have been off lately," and I set the phone down without replying, because that was the closest he had come to recognizing something was wrong, and even then, it was framed in a way that kept him just outside of responsibility. The next day, his mother called again, her tone warm, concerned. "Ethan mentioned you have been stressed. Are you taking care of yourself?" she asked, and I stood by the window, looking out at the street below, watching people move through their routines, unaware of anything beyond their own lives. "I am fine," I said, and she continued, "Marriage takes effort, Valerie. Sometimes you have to meet each other halfway." And I closed my eyes for a second, because I had been meeting him more than halfway for years, and now that I had stepped back even slightly, it was suddenly visible, noticeable, a problem that needed to be corrected. "I understand," I replied, my voice steady, and when the call ended, I stood there in the quiet phone still in my hand, realizing that everything around me was still operating on the same assumptions, the same narrative, the same version of events that no longer matched what I knew, and for the first time, I felt something settle fully into place. Not anger, not sadness, but distance, a clear, unmistakable distance between who I had been in this relationship and who I was becoming. And as I stood there alone in that silence, I understood that whatever came next, I would be facing it without the version of connection I once believed we had. I did not cry the night everything settled into silence, and I think that was the part that surprised me the most. Not the distance, not the lies, not even the realization of how long I had been standing alone inside something I thought was shared, but the absence of emotion where I expected it to be, like I had reached a point so far beyond hurt that there was nothing left to react with. That night, Ethan came home later than usual. The house already dark, except for the soft light above the stove, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop closed in front of me, hands folded, not working, not scrolling, just sitting there in a stillness that felt unfamiliar even to me. He paused when he saw me, just for a second, like he had expected something else, maybe noise, maybe movement, maybe the version of me that filled space so he would not have to notice it was empty. "You are still up," he said, setting his keys down slowly, and I nodded once. I could not sleep. I replied, my voice steady, and he hesitated before walking closer, pulling out the chair across from me but not sitting down right away. "Val, we cannot keep doing this," he said finally, his tone tired in a way that suggested inconvenience more than concern, and I looked at him, really looked at him, noticing how easily he framed this as something mutual, something shared, something we were both responsible for. "Doing what?" I asked, and he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "This distance, this silence, it is not healthy," he said, and I almost smiled again, because for years I had been the one trying to close that distance, trying to fill that silence, and now that I had stopped, it had suddenly become visible. "I am here," I said simply, and that seemed to frustrate him more than anything else, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to correct, nothing to redirect. He sat down slowly, leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "If something is wrong, you need to tell me," he said, and there was something in his voice now, not quite urgency, not quite fear, but something closer to discomfort, like he could sense that he was no longer in control of something he had not realized he was controlling before. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at the table, tracing the edge of the wood with my finger, a small, absent movement that gave me just enough space to think before speaking. "Do you ever feel like you are talking to someone who stopped listening a long time ago?" I asked quietly, and he frowned, confusion settling in his expression. "What does that even mean?" he replied, and I nodded slightly, because that was the point. He did not understand. Not because he could not, but because he had never needed to. "Nothing," I said, pulling my hand back, folding it into my lap, and that was when the conversation ended, not with a resolution, not with an argument, but with a kind of quiet collapse, the kind that happens when there is nothing left to hold something up anymore. The days that followed felt different in a way that was hard to explain. Everything looked the same on the outside. Same routines, same spaces, same conversations, but underneath it all there was a kind of absence, like something essential had been removed and nothing had filled the space it left behind. At work, I moved through everything with precision, meetings, reports, decisions, all of it clear, structured, controlled, because that was the one place where things still made sense, where effort led to outcome, where attention revealed truth, and people responded to what was actually there instead of what they expected to see. "You have been quiet lately," my supervisor said one afternoon, standing by my desk with a folder in her hand, and I looked up, meeting her eyes. "Just focused," I replied, and she nodded, watching me for a moment longer than necessary. "Well, whatever you are doing, it is working. The last audit you led was one of the cleanest we have seen," she said, placing the folder down in front of me, and I thanked her, meaning it, because that recognition felt real in a way nothing else did anymore. But even that did not fill what had shifted inside me. It just highlighted the contrast, the difference between a space where I was seen clearly and one where I had spent years being misunderstood in ways I had learned to accept as normal. One evening, I sat alone in the living room, the television on but muted, watching the light flicker across the walls without really seeing it, and my phone buzzed softly on the coffee table, a message from Ethan, even though he was in the other room. "Are you okay?" it read, and I picked it up, staring at the words, considering how to answer something that had become impossible to explain in simple terms. "I am fine," I typed back, because that was the closest thing to truth I could offer without opening something neither of us was prepared to face. And a few seconds later, another message appeared, "It does not feel like you are," and I set the phone down without responding, because he was right, but also too late, because whatever had been between us, whatever connection we had relied on to navigate everything else, was no longer intact, and there was no simple conversation that could restore it. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and I realized that the loneliness I felt was not new. It had been there for a long time. I had just been too busy filling it, managing it, explaining it away to recognize it for what it was, and now that I had stopped, now that I had allowed it to exist without distraction, it felt deeper, quieter, more complete, in a way that left no room for denial. But somewhere beneath that stillness, beneath the quiet weight of everything that had settled into place, there was something else, something small but steady, not quite hope, not quite strength, but something that suggested this was not the end of the story, just the end of the part where I kept pretending everything was still the same. I stopped waiting for things to change at home and started moving differently in the only place that still responded to effort, because rebuilding did not begin with a big decision. It began with small actions that did not require anyone else to approve them, and the first one was simple. I stayed later at work, not because I had to, but because I wanted to finish something completely, without interruption, without explaining why it mattered. The office was quieter after 6, the overhead lights dimmed in sections, the hum softer, and I sat at my desk reviewing a set of flagged accounts that no one else had prioritized yet, tracing inconsistencies line by line, making notes in the margins the way I always did, precise, contained, focused. "You are still here?" Mark asked as he walked past, loosening his tie, his voice surprised but not critical, and I looked up. "I wanted to close this out tonight," I said, tapping the file lightly, and he stepped closer, scanning the screen for a second. "This is the Mercer case, right? People have been avoiding that one," he said, and I nodded. "It is not complicated. It just needs attention," I replied, and he gave a small nod, something like respect in the gesture. "Well, if you crack it, that will get noticed," he said before heading out, and I turned back to the screen without responding, not because I did not hear him, but because for the first time, being noticed was not the goal, getting it right was. At home, the rhythm stayed the same, but I did not feel it anymore. I moved through the space without adjusting myself to it, without anticipating what would make things easier for someone else, and that changed the atmosphere in ways I could feel, even if no one said it out loud. "You have been working a lot," Ethan said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter while I packed my bag for the next day, and I zipped it closed before looking at him. "So have you," I replied, and he shifted slightly, like he expected more, like he was waiting for me to soften it, to balance it. But I did not, and after a moment he just nodded. "Yeah," he said, and the conversation ended there. Not resolved, not escalated, just different. I started saying no to things I used to automatically agree to. Small things at first, dinners I did not have time for, weekend plans that felt more like obligation than choice. "We are all getting together on Sunday," his mother said over the phone, her tone already assuming my answer. "You will come, right?" And I stood by my desk, looking at the calendar open on my screen. "I have a deadline," I said, keeping my voice even. And there was a pause, brief but noticeable. "Family is important, Valerie," she replied, and I nodded, even though she could not see it. "So is my work," I said. And when the call ended, I sat there for a second, noticing the absence of guilt where it used to be, noticing how the decision stayed intact without needing to be justified beyond what I had already said. At the office, the Mercer case unfolded slowly, layers revealing themselves the way they always did when you gave them enough time, enough attention, and I built something from it, not just a report, but a structure that connected details others had overlooked, timelines that aligned in ways that made the inconsistencies impossible to ignore. "Walk me through this," my supervisor said during the review meeting, sliding the file back toward me, and I did, step by step, clear, direct, without rushing, without over-explaining. And when I finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than usual. "This is solid," she said finally, tapping the page lightly. "We are going to escalate this." And I nodded, not reacting outwardly, but feeling that same steady shift inside, the one that had been building slowly over the past weeks, becoming something more defined, more reliable. Ethan noticed the change, even if he did not understand it. The way I moved through the house without checking in, the way I answered questions without opening space for interpretation, the way I stopped reacting to the small things that used to create tension. "You are different lately," he said one night, standing in the doorway while I worked at the dining table, and I did not look up right away. Just finished the sentence I was writing before responding. "I am focused," I said, and he let out a short breath, something between frustration and confusion. "On what?" he asked, and I closed my laptop slowly, meeting his eyes. "On what matters," I replied, and that was all I gave him, because anything more would have required me to explain a process he had not been part of, a shift he had not contributed to, and I was no longer interested in translating myself into something easier for him to understand. The next morning, I left the house earlier than usual, the air still cool, the street quiet, and as I got into my car, I realized I was not thinking about what I had left behind, not replaying conversations, not anticipating reactions, just moving forward into something that felt clearer than anything I had experienced in a long time. At work, the escalation of the Mercer case moved quickly. Meetings scheduled, additional reviews requested, my name appearing in emails that included people I had never interacted with before, and I responded to each one with the same measured clarity, the same attention to detail that had brought me here in the first place. "We are going to need you in the executive review on Thursday," my supervisor said, handing me the updated schedule, and I took it without hesitation. "I will be there," I replied, and she nodded, watching me for a moment. "You have stepped into this role faster than we expected," she said, and I gave a small, controlled smile. "I have been preparing for it longer than anyone realized," I said, and that was the closest I came to explaining anything. Driving home that evening, the city moving steadily around me, I felt something settle into place, not as a final outcome, not as a conclusion, but as direction, clear, intentional, something that extended beyond the situation I had been navigating at home, something that suggested there was more ahead than what I had been trying to hold together behind me, and for the first time, I did not wonder if I would be able to handle it. I just knew that whatever came next, I would meet it fully, without shrinking, without adjusting, without losing myself in the process, and somewhere in that certainty, I recognized the beginning of something that had the potential to grow into more than just stability, something that looked a lot like success, even if I had not defined it yet. I stopped noticing the looks first, then the whispers, and eventually even the shift in tone when people spoke to me, because once you step fully into your role, you do not need external confirmation to feel it. You recognize it in the way decisions move through you, in the way people pause when you speak, in the way rooms change just slightly when you enter them. The executive review meeting was held on the 12th floor, a space I had only seen from the outside before. Glass walls, long polished table, city stretching out in every direction like a reminder of how much existed beyond the small spaces we limit ourselves to. And when I walked in that morning, badge clipped neatly to my blazer, my name printed clearly beneath the updated title, Lead Compliance Auditor. I felt it settle in a way that was different from anything before. Not excitement, not nerves, just alignment, like everything I had been building quietly had finally taken visible form. "Valerie, glad you could join us," one of the senior executives said, standing to shake my hand, his grip firm, his tone respectful, and I met it without hesitation. "Thank you for having me," I replied, my voice steady, and I took my seat without looking around for validation, without checking who was watching, because I already knew why I was there. When they asked me to walk through the findings, I did not rush. I did not soften the details. I presented everything exactly as it was, clear, structured, grounded in evidence that spoke for itself. "These inconsistencies are not isolated," I said, tapping the page lightly. "They follow a pattern, and that pattern indicates intentional misrepresentation across multiple reporting periods." And the room stayed quiet, not tense, just attentive, the kind of silence that comes when people are actually listening instead of waiting to speak. "How confident are you in this conclusion?" another voice asked from across the table, and I met his eyes directly. "Completely," I said, not adding qualifiers, not stepping back from the statement, and he nodded slowly, making a note in front of him, and in that moment, I understood something clearly. Confidence is not volume. It is precision. It is knowing exactly what you are saying and standing in it without adjustment. After the meeting, my supervisor caught up with me in the hallway, her expression lighter than I had ever seen it. "That was exactly what we needed," she said, handing me a printed summary with my name listed at the top, and I glanced at it briefly before folding it into my folder. "It was all there," I replied, and she smiled. "Yes, but you were the one who saw it," she said, and I did not deflect it this time. I just nodded once, accepting it without minimizing, without explaining it away. The changes followed quickly after that. New responsibilities, direct communication with leadership, meetings added to my schedule that used to happen without me, and with each step, the space I occupied expanded. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, in ways that were impossible to ignore. "We would like you to lead the next internal review as well," one of the directors said during a follow-up call, his tone formal but clear, and I replied without hesitation, "I will prepare the framework this afternoon," and when the call ended, I sat back for a moment, not to celebrate, not to reflect, just to acknowledge the fact that I was no longer waiting to be included. I was already inside the room. At home, the contrast grew sharper, not because anything there changed, but because I did. And once you change, you cannot unsee the imbalance that used to feel normal. "You have been coming home later," Ethan said one evening, standing by the doorway as I set my bag down, and I glanced at the clock briefly before looking at him. "I had a meeting," I replied, and he nodded slowly, studying me in a way that felt unfamiliar, like he was trying to place something he had not noticed before. "You did not tell me," he said, and I paused, considering the statement. "You did not ask," I replied, not sharply, just directly, and that seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have, because there was no tone to react to, no emotion to redirect, just a simple reflection of what had been true for a long time. His phone buzzed on the counter a few seconds later, and he glanced at it quickly before turning it over, a habit I had stopped reacting to, not because it no longer mattered, but because I no longer needed confirmation from it. I already had what I needed. "Are you working this weekend?" he asked, shifting the conversation, and I nodded once. "Yes," I said, and he exhaled, something like frustration crossing his face. "You used to make time," he said, and I looked at him for a moment, noticing how easily the past was framed as a standard I should return to. "I used to make space," I corrected quietly, and he frowned slightly, like the distinction did not make sense to him, like he had never needed to consider the difference. Later that night, as I reviewed notes at the dining table, my badge still clipped to my blazer, catching the light each time I moved, I realized that it had become more than just identification. It was a marker, a visible representation of something internal that had been building long before anyone else noticed it, and I reached up briefly, adjusting it, not out of habit, but out of awareness, because for the first time, I was fully occupying the role I had earned without shrinking it to fit someone else's expectations. The following morning, I stood in front of the mirror for a moment longer than usual, not adjusting my appearance, but recognizing the person looking back at me, the steadiness in her expression, the clarity in her posture, the absence of hesitation that used to be there. And as I picked up my keys and stepped out the door, I understood that whatever came next, I would meet it from this place, not the one I had outgrown. And as I drove toward the office, the city unfolding ahead of me, I thought back briefly to that kitchen, to the suitcase, to the moment everything shifted, and I realized that I was no longer standing in that version of the story. I was moving toward something else entirely, something that would eventually bring me back to that same space, but not as the person who had once stood there questioning. This time I would return with answers. The hospital lobby smelled like antiseptic and overbrewed coffee, the kind that had been sitting on a warmer too long, and I stood just inside the sliding glass doors for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the brightness, letting the noise settle into something I could separate into pieces, footsteps, distant announcements, the low hum of conversations that all seemed to carry the same quiet urgency. And for a second I almost turned around, not because I was unsure, but because I knew that once I stepped further in, there would be no version of this that stayed contained, no version where I could pretend I did not know what I already knew. "Ma'am, can I help you?" the woman at the front desk asked, her voice polite but efficient. And I walked forward slowly, my heels clicking softly against the tile. "I am here to visit someone," I said, giving the name carefully, watching her expression as she typed it in, and there it was, just a flicker, recognition, confirmation. Something that told me I was exactly where I needed to be. "She is in the outpatient wing, 3rd floor," she replied, printing a visitor badge and sliding it across the counter, and I picked it up, feeling the weight of it settle into my hand. Another marker, another piece of this moment aligning with everything that had led me here. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of me that looked composed, steady, unchanged, and I studied it briefly, not adjusting anything, just acknowledging that this was the face he would see, the one that would not give anything away until I chose to. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched out in front of me, quiet, controlled, the kind of silence that exists in places where people are waiting for answers they may not be ready to hear, and I walked forward, counting the doors without realizing it, each step measured, each movement intentional. I did not need to check my phone, I did not need to confirm anything, because everything I had already found had led me here, to this exact moment, to this exact place, and the only thing left was timing. I stopped just before the waiting area, the soft murmur of voices reaching me before I saw them, and I recognized his voice immediately. Not because it was loud, but because I knew the rhythm of it, the way it shifted when he was trying to sound calm, the way it softened when he thought he needed to be reassuring. "It is going to be fine," Ethan was saying, his tone lower than usual, controlled, and I stepped just enough to see them without being seen, him sitting beside her, leaning slightly forward, his hand resting close but not quite touching, like he was careful about appearances even here, even now. Claire looked smaller than I expected, not fragile, but contained, her posture tight, her expression focused in a way that suggested she was holding something in place internally, something that required effort. "You said it was nothing serious," she replied, her voice steady but edged with something I recognized immediately. Uncertainty layered over trust, and Ethan nodded quickly. "That is what they said. It is just a precaution, routine follow-up," he said, and I felt that familiar shift again, the way his words aligned just enough with truth to sound believable, the way he shaped information into something easier to accept, not fully false, but not fully honest either. "Do you want me to stay?" he added, and she hesitated for a second before nodding. "Yes," she said quietly, and he gave a small, reassuring smile, the same one I had seen in our kitchen, the same one he used when he wanted to close a conversation without actually resolving it. I stepped back slightly, out of view again, my hand resting lightly against the wall, grounding myself in the stillness of the moment, because this was not about reacting, not about confronting, not yet. This was about understanding exactly how everything fit together in real time, not just in files and timelines, but in behavior, in choices, in the way he moved between two versions of the same story, without ever fully merging them. A nurse walked past me then, clipboard in hand, glancing briefly at my visitor badge before continuing down the hall, and I used that moment to move forward again, stepping into the waiting area fully this time, my presence no longer hidden, no longer delayed. Ethan looked up first, his expression shifting instantly. Surprise, confusion, something else underneath that he did not have time to mask completely. "Val," he said, standing halfway, like he was not sure whether to come toward me or stay where he was, and Claire turned slightly, her eyes moving between us, searching for context she did not have yet. I met his gaze calmly, letting the silence stretch just enough to settle over all three of us, not uncomfortable, not chaotic, just present, undeniable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice lower now, tighter, and I tilted my head slightly, considering the question, not because I needed to answer it, but because I wanted to choose how this moment unfolded. "I came to see someone," I said simply, and his eyes flickered for a second, a small movement that revealed more than any words could have, because in that instant, he understood that this was not coincidence, not misunderstanding. This was alignment, intentional, precise. Claire shifted in her seat, her gaze settling on me with quiet focus. "Do I know you?" she asked, her tone careful, and I looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time, seeing not just the person in front of me, but the connection, the overlap, the hidden structure that had brought all of us into the same space without any of us fully realizing it until now. "Not yet," I replied softly, and I took one step closer, my voice steady, my posture relaxed, everything about me controlled in a way that did not require effort anymore, because I was no longer reacting to this situation. I was guiding it. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes moving between us, calculating, searching for a way to redirect, to regain control of a conversation that had not even fully started yet. And I let him, just for a moment, just long enough for the tension to build naturally, for the silence to deepen into something that could not be ignored. And then I opened my mouth, not to explain, not to accuse, but to ask the one question that would bring everything into the open at once. I let the silence settle fully before I spoke, not rushing the moment, not filling the space the way I used to, because this time the weight of it mattered, the timing mattered, and when I finally looked directly at Claire, my voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "Do you know what illness you have?" I asked. And the question landed exactly where it needed to. Not loud, not aggressive, just precise. And for a second, nothing moved. No one spoke. The hallway noise faded into something distant, like it no longer belonged to this moment. Claire blinked slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to something more focused, something searching, and she glanced at Ethan instinctively, like he was supposed to answer for her, like he always had. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice steady but edged now with something sharper, and Ethan stepped forward slightly, his posture tightening. "Valerie, this is not the place," he said quickly, his tone controlled but strained underneath, and I turned my gaze to him, holding it without reacting. "You told her it was routine," I said, not raising my voice, not accusing, just stating what I already knew, and his jaw tightened, just slightly. That small tell he had never realized I noticed. "It is routine," he replied, too fast, too certain, and I shook my head once, a small movement. "No, it is not," I said, and the difference between those two sentences sat heavily in the space between us, because mine did not need reinforcement, it did not need explanation, it was already grounded in something real. Claire looked between us again, her posture shifting now, no longer passive, no longer just listening. "Ethan?" she said, her voice lower, more direct this time, and he hesitated, just long enough for the moment to expand, for the gap between what he had told her and what was actually true to become visible. "It is just a follow-up," he said again, softer now, but the repetition did not make it stronger. It made it weaker, like he was trying to hold something together that had already started to come apart. I took another step forward, not invading, just closing the distance enough to keep the moment contained, to keep it from slipping back into something vague or avoidable. "The diagnosis was confirmed last week," I said, looking at Claire, not him, because this was not about arguing with Ethan anymore. This was about clarity, and she froze slightly, her fingers tightening against the edge of her chair. "What diagnosis?" she asked, and I could see it now. The shift, the realization that there was information she did not have. Information that had been kept just out of reach. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair again. A gesture that used to signal frustration but now looked like something else entirely, something closer to being cornered. "Valerie, stop," he said, his voice lower now, urgent in a way that confirmed everything without needing to say it directly, and I turned to him briefly, meeting his eyes. "You stopped a long time ago," I replied quietly, and that was the closest I came to emotion. Not anger, not accusation, just a simple acknowledgement of what had already happened. Claire stood up slowly then, her gaze fixed on Ethan now, not me, and the distance between them shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore, no longer aligned, no longer supported by the same understanding. "What is she talking about?" she asked, each word measured, controlled, and Ethan looked at her, then at me, then back again, searching for something, some version of this he could still manage, but there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to soften. "It is nothing," he said finally, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded empty, disconnected from everything around them. I reached into my bag slowly, not dramatically, just deliberately, and pulled out the printed summary I had reviewed more times than I could count, placing it gently on the table between them, not pushing it toward either of them, just setting it there where it could not be ignored. "You should read it," I said, my tone even, and Claire looked down at the paper, then back at me, hesitation flickering across her face before she picked it up, her eyes moving quickly across the lines, slowing as the meaning settled in, as the terminology shifted from unfamiliar to undeniable. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, sharper, not empty but full, filled with everything that had just been exposed without needing to be said out loud again. Ethan did not speak, did not move. His focus fixed on the table like he could somehow avoid what was happening by not engaging with it directly. And for the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain, not just caught, but unprepared. Claire lowered the paper slowly, her expression no longer confused, no longer searching, but something else entirely, something that did not need explanation. And she looked at him again, not asking, not waiting, just seeing him clearly for the first time. "You knew," she said, her voice quiet, but there was no question in it, only recognition, and Ethan opened his mouth slightly, like he was about to respond, but nothing came out, nothing that could hold against what was already there in front of him. I stood there for a moment longer, not to witness the outcome, not to stay for the reaction, but to allow the truth to settle fully into the space, because this was not about winning, not about confrontation, it was about alignment, about bringing everything into the open, where it could no longer be reshaped into something else. And as I turned slightly, stepping back just enough to create distance again, I realized that the shock was not in what had been revealed. It was in the fact that none of them, not Ethan, not Claire, not anyone who had accepted his version of events without question, had ever considered that I might already know everything before they even realized something was wrong. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic happened, no final confrontation, no explosive ending, just a quiet unraveling that felt almost gentle compared to everything that came before, and I think that is what surprised me the most. How something that once held so much tension could dissolve into something so still, so clear, like a storm that had finally passed without leaving destruction behind, just space, just air you could actually breathe again. I moved into a smaller apartment across the city, nothing extravagant, just a one-bedroom with large windows that let in morning light, the kind that fills the room slowly, without forcing itself in, and for the first time in a long time, I woke up without immediately calculating someone else's needs before my own, without adjusting my day around expectations that were never spoken but always present. The quiet there felt different, not empty, not heavy, just honest. Like it was not asking anything from me except to exist within it. At work, things continued to grow, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that felt earned, steady, aligned with the effort I had been putting in long before anyone noticed, and each decision I made, each meeting I led, carried a clarity that had nothing to do with proving something and everything to do with knowing where I stood. "You seem lighter," my supervisor said one afternoon, handing me a new set of files, and I paused for a second, considering the word, before nodding slightly. "I think I am," I replied, And that was the simplest way to explain it, because there was no longer anything pulling me in opposite directions, no longer any version of myself being shaped by someone else's expectations. I did not hear from Ethan in the way I once did. The constant messages, the attempts to explain or repair, they faded quickly once it became clear that I was no longer responding in the way he expected, and when he did reach out, it was different, less certain, less structured, like he was no longer sure which version of me he was speaking to. "I did not realize how much I misunderstood," he said once, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, and I listened without interrupting, without correcting, because understanding, real understanding, is something that has to come from within, not something you can hand to someone else. "I know," I replied simply, and that was enough, because I was no longer trying to fix what had already revealed itself so clearly. Claire, I heard, had made her own decisions, her own adjustments, and I did not follow the details, not out of indifference, but out of respect for the fact that her path was not mine to manage, just as mine was no longer tied to theirs. The truth had done what it needed to do. It had brought everything into the light, and what happened after that belonged to each of us individually. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city settle into its own rhythm, lights flickering on one by one, people moving through their lives in ways I could only observe from a distance, and I would think about how easily we ignore our own instincts, how often we choose comfort over clarity, not because we are weak, but because we are human, because we want things to work. We want to believe in the version of life we have built, even when something inside us is quietly telling us it does not fully align. And that is the lesson I carry with me now, not as something heavy, not as something that defines me, but as something that guides me, a quiet awareness that my voice, my perception, my intuition are not things to be minimized or questioned away. They are tools, they are signals, they are part of the way I move through the world with integrity. If you are listening to this and something in your life feels off, something small, something you cannot quite explain, I hope you give yourself permission to pay attention to it, not to react immediately, not to assume the worst, but to listen, because sometimes the truth does not arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, and your only job is to stay present long enough to see it clearly. Protect your peace the same way you protect your time. Be mindful of where your energy goes, and do not be afraid to step back from anything that requires you to become smaller just to keep it intact, because the right things, the right people, the right life, they do not need you to disappear in order to exist. There is something almost spiritual in that realization, something that feels like alignment with something greater than just circumstance, whether you call it intuition, faith, or simply the universe guiding you toward what is meant for you. It is there, quiet but consistent, waiting for you to trust it. Thank you for staying with me through this, for listening, for allowing this story to exist in your space for a moment, because I know how isolating these experiences can feel, how easy it is to believe you are the only one navigating something like this, and you are not even close. My name is Valerie Cruz. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Do not lose yourself trying to preserve something that no longer sees you clearly. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share where you are listening from or what time it is in your part of the world. I always find it grounding to know how far these moments travel. And if you feel like there is more to explore, more stories that might speak to something you are carrying, there are others waiting for you, each one unfolding in its own way. Each one offering a different perspective, a different kind of understanding, and maybe, just maybe, one of them will meet you exactly where you are right now.